Hey, welcome back to the AIPF Summit. And we are ready now for the third and final panel, and that will be a capstone of this event. This panel will discuss social media. This is something that I, and I'm sure many of you, see as an area that is, on the one hand, one of the the one in the most most urgent need of a policy intervention. On the other hand, this is an area where things are quite unclear, and it's really not clear to me at least what this intervention could even be and what kind of mechanism it could use. Fortunately, this star panel will hopefully and actually surely bring us some clarity here on this topic, and it will be led by the inimitable moderator, Professor Ozdaglar, who not only is the head of the MIT EECS department and also the deputy dean in the Schwarzman College of Computing, but also a deep and ferocious thinker. So you are up for a treat. Asu, please take it away.
Thank you, Alexander, for the wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Ozdaglar, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to join us for this discussion on social media reform with our very distinguished panelists. I'm really very excited to have this discussion today on such an important and timely topic. As Alexander mentioned, social media is a topic of great interest for many of us. It's basically, if you look at it, transformed completely in a short 2 decades our ways of life, the way that billions of people around the world, how they communicate with each other, how they form communities, obtain information, and engage in political discourse. And so, of course, there was an initial great promise. And of course, the hyperconnectivity brought a lot of positive effects. But there's also increasing recognition now that this sort of transformation of our, usual well-established ways are leading to several changes in our existing social order, some of them with some alarming costs. There's now considerable evidence that social media creates new mental health challenges for people, especially youth, propagates misinformation or extremist content, and even hampers political dialogue between people with different ideologies. So where does AI come into all this? Of course, this is AI Policy Forum. But if you think about it, we cannot even think about social media without AI. AI and machine learning is exactly at the root of every aspect of social media, collecting data, making recommendations, shaping the social connections and social networks, and targeting ads to users. So the role of these algorithms in sort of various aspects of social media, ranging from filter bubbles, creation of filter bubbles, or propagation of different kinds of content, is very well documented in the last couple of years. The other aspect that I would like to emphasize is, of course, we cannot understand, the implications of these algorithms without recognizing that they are really designed by very much these platforms and according to certain business models, so not necessarily social good. So this is why I think this is the sort of complex landscape I'm trying to hopefully bring together, that any discussion, any well thought out solution really must start from this realization that what we're dealing with is not just a social problem, not just a political problem, not just a technical problem, but sort of the complex interplay between all of them. And of course, this makes the perfect topic for AIPF. And the other thing I'd like to also mention briefly is, of course, the nature of public pressure and how it actually represents sort of the divergent opinions in public and how it actually represents social media landscape. Some of the views put sort of blame on social media companies because they're in fact, allowing for misinformation spreading on these platforms. So they call for tighter regulation of what is allowed, or at least what is, boosted or propagated in these platforms. And others take the opposite view and argue that maybe they're overly restrictive in what they allow on these platforms. And all of this discussion is at the background of a particular legal framework with First Amendment protection of free speech in US, as well as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, protecting the platforms against any liability for content created by third parties. So what does this all mean for our current state, future of social media, our democracy, political discourse, free speech? So I can hardly think of more challenging but urgent questions. Fortunately, I can also not think of a better panel to actually discuss and enlighten us on all these questions. So I would like to go ahead and start with the panelist introductions and ask each of our panelists to give a quick introductions of themselves. I will go in alphabetical order according to last name. So let's start maybe with Professor Daron Acemoglu. Daron?
Hi, thank you, Asu. My name is Daron Acemoglu. I am an institute professor at MIT in the economics department, and I work on political economy, technology inequality, and their broader societal implications. And that has brought me to social media. And I tend to sort of view social media in the broader ecosystem of the technologies that have been introduced over the last 4 decades. And I am looking forward to the discussion in this panel, from which I'm sure I will learn as much as possible.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Daron. And I'd like to next go to Professor Marta Minow. Marta.
It's an honor to be here, and I know I'm going to learn a lot. I teach at Harvard Law School, where I've been for the last 41 years, and I served as dean here. My most recent book is called Saving the News. The Constitution Calls for Government Action to Preserve the Freedom of Speech, and focuses a lot on the topic of our panel. And I have a chapter in a recently published book called Social Media, Freedom of Speech, and the Future of Our Democracy. I've also served on the board of a large publicly traded media corporation, and also currently serve on the board of a large public media nonprofit organization. And the relationship between our topic and the larger media ecosystem is a lot of my preoccupation, as well as its impact on democratic governance.
Thank you. This is wonderful, so relevant to everything that we're thinking about here. So I would like to next go to Dean Alejandro Poiré. Alejandro, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I am really happy to be a part of this panel. I am a political scientist by training. That's what I teach, and I've worked on electoral behavior and public opinion. But I've also been a public servant. I've been a part of Mexico's Federal Electoral Authority when it was just a federal authority. It's now a national authority. And I've also been a minister of governance or interior a couple of administrations ago under President Felipe Calderon. I'm now the dean of the School of Government and Public Transformation at Tecnológico de Monterrey.
Great, thank you all. So we have a lot to discuss, but before we dive in, I'd like to, make sure to remind everyone that we would like this panel to be interactive. So we very much welcome your participation in the conversation. Please enter your questions at any time. There's a box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will pull the questions from there and try to get to as many as we can at the end of our discussion during the Q&A. So, okay, maybe I'll just jump in and start perhaps with a question for all three of our panelists. I hope I was able to sort of in my introduction highlight that there are a lot of concerns about the negative impact of social media on our society, including, polarization, maybe rise of misinformation, and, also increasingly a number of works on potential damage to mental health. I wanted to basically maybe have an initial comments on which of these negative impacts do you think are most damaging to our society? And also maybe a related question is, do you think the existing dominant platforms are in any way exacerbating these effects, or some scholars claim that maybe they're better than some of the other platforms or offline media in limiting some of these negative consequences. So what are your thoughts on that? Marta, please.
Well, I think that actually all of the harms that you describe are interconnected. So when there are for-profit companies that actually have a business model dependent on the engagement, how long people stay engaged, which is true of the dominant platforms, Google, Meta, formerly known as Facebook, and so forth, then there is every incentive to actually promote and the amplification of speech that actually is hateful, arouses emotions, otherwise engages attention. In fact, it has struck me that the large media platforms are full employment for psychologists because they hire a lot of psychologists to make sure that people stay engaged as long as possible because they're selling eyeballs, they're selling ads, and so forth. And the link between that and polarization is rather obvious, that there are personalized news feeds and other ways in which the information sorts itself out based on what people have looked at in the past and what they send to their friends and family. And that seems in turn also linked to mental health problems. We didn't actually even need a whistleblower, but we have one telling us that about the internal memoranda inside of Facebook warning about mental health problems, particularly for youth. The monopolization, it probably is more like oligopolization, but there is certainly a concentration of economic power. And yet, to your related question, the dominant platforms at least understand that they need to appear to be doing something like moderation. They contribute enormously to the circulation of misinformation, disinformation, fake information, and hateful information, but at least they come up with policies to try to address the subject, whereas some of the smaller platforms and the message boards associated with gaming software and other kinds of material don't even pretend to be moderating. So I think that the problem is that this is a problem that's bigger than any company, than any sector. It's a problem that actually requires coordinated action across public and private policy.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Daron, do you want to?
I can jump in. I mean, I completely agree with what Martha said. I was going to say the same thing, but she said it much more eloquently. But indeed, I think these aspects are all interrelated, and they are in turn very much underpin the business model that has come to dominate online media. But I think we can go even one step deeper, and we can think of the nature of the technology, its potential disruptive effects, and then how this is being amplified and developed via the business models of these companies and the permissive regulatory environment that we have at the moment. You know, I think it's a truism that A, technology itself is not good or bad, it depends on how you use it. But B, despite that, all major technologies have a disruptive element. This is no less true of other communication technologies that have come in the past. You know, the printing press was very early on used for extremism and hateful information, no less by Martin Luther himself. Radio, likewise, TV, likewise. But there is something slightly different about social media, which is not unrelated to the current issues we're talking about, which is that, you know, despite the huge revolutionary effects of the printing press, it never could replace individuals' real life social networks. And a lot of the way that we participate in social life, including democratic discourse, is via our social networks. We talk to friends, neighbors, people who have similar ideas, sometimes similar passions, related membership in clubs, business organizations, neighborhoods. And information that we get from broadcast sources, including print media, is partially filtered through these social networks. Social media, broadly speaking, is perhaps the first medium that has the ambition of reshaping, remaking, and perhaps sidelining our social network. And what this does potentially is introduce a whole host of communication patterns and influence patterns that we as human communities are not used to. You know, social networks have a role of mediating information, acting as barriers. For example, you know, that information that you have cannot possibly be true, coming from your friends, people you trust. Well, all of that is potentially torn apart by social media, because now the social media itself has given you a social network that can validate whatever other information that social media platforms are giving you. So that opens up a whole host of new possibilities. I think even with the best business model and the best regulation, my sense is that that would have been very disruptive, and that would have been potentially very dangerous for democracy, for extremism, for extremist ideologies organizing through social networks that they couldn't previously form. But on top of it, exactly like Marta said, now you put an extremely permissive regulatory system and digital platforms that are completely obsessed with keeping people as engaged, which means forming layers of artificial social networks that are going to keep them glued to their screens. Now you have potentially a combustible mix in there. And of course, the business model, which is, again, Marta put it, based on digital ads, is really an inseparable part of this. And also, you summarized all of the problems very well and already started hinting at solutions, monopolization, trying to regulate misinformation. We'll come back to this, but I don't think we can have any of those solutions without completely disrupting this business model in a very, very fundamental way. Everything else we do, technological fixes, regulatory fixes, I think they would be putting band-aids. So I think we have to really understand the nature of the social media ecosystem, plus the monster that the digital platforms business model has created here.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very helpful. So Alejandro, I wonder if you would like to add, or
this has been, I think the summary of arguments has already been very compelling. I would like to be a bit more precise about a few of these concerns that I think are very well placed. We are very concerned, I think, about the quality and type of information that individuals and societies are getting through social media. Misinformation, disinformation, Martha mentioned it very precisely. We are also very concerned about polarization, and scholars distinguish between ideological polarization, distance in issue positioning, and the like. But I think the most concerning issue is affective polarization. And this is the fact that the dynamic of the dialogue is not anymore about we differ on, say, the tax rate or the amount of subsidies or how we're going to deal with a particular issue. No, we see each other as enemies. And that affective polarization, I think, is the most concerning of a number of these problems, because this can actually generate behavior that is, hate-filled, and the inability to compromise, and it generates dynamics of very dangerous behavior as well. Of course, hate speech and what that implies, generally speaking, and also when we talk about this, and especially if we focus on the political realm, we are concerned about foreign intervention, for example, of, Russia in American elections, and so on and so forth. But this last point actually points to an element of social media that I think has been mentioned, but that I would actually want to expand on, which is that as we worry about somebody who doesn't have a standing, for example, foreign governments or foreign agents shouldn't have a standing in domestic elections, let's put it that way. Part of what happens with social media is that we really do not know who's behind. And it's not just the anonymity of the source, is that sometimes the source or the mediator is unidentifiable, and sometimes it's even a bot. It's part of a number of programs or algorithms that are actually creating, because of the business model that has already been alluded to, creating certain types of information flows, creating certain types of targeting strategies. And we do not even know, and this is something that at the very beginning of the forum today, Eric Schmidt was alluding to, we do not even know whether the source of this information is human or not. And I think as we look at all of these concerns, we need to be aware that the element of distinction between what is human and what is not is very important. And the element of distinction of what we can actually regulate and not is also very important. And I think there's something that needs to be said, because I think the four of us are to a certain extent in agreement, but perhaps not everybody who's listening to this conversation is in agreement, because as it is with this literature, there's an emerging literature, there's not enough evidence on a number of these questions, but there is some systematic evidence aside from journalistic reports. There is one issue where we should probably be very specific about as well. When you look at the impact of political communication on political behavior, there is a very well-known strand of the literature, which is the minimal effects literature, which is that, oh, on average, most of the time, I mean, only a very small segment of the people are very heavily engaged in media consumption. Let's put social media there. And it's only for very limited segments of the population where some of these most concerning effects might be present. And I think we should be explicit about the fact that A, we still do not have strong enough evidence as to say, oh, we shouldn't be concerned. And B, there are both normative and practical implications of this minimal effects literature that we should be wary of. We are concerned about the sanctity of the vote. If we put it in very political terms, we are very concerned about one person, one vote, and equal influence to everyone in the political realm. And that is why we are concerned about the flow of information that every single individual in a citizenry is able to obtain. That is why we are concerned about the potential of misinformation, about the potential of disinformation, and about polarization in and of itself. So yes, I mean, there might be some research reports that, or papers published, very valuable research that says, oh, well, maybe the effects are not that big. That doesn't mean that it's not a matter of concern. And I think we should be very, very careful about that. Also, because even if the effect is marginal and very limited, there might be some particular cases in which a very tiny marginal effect has momentous effects in the lives of individuals in a society, in a particular election, or so on and so forth. So I just wanted to put that warning out there, because I know that there are some people in academia and in public opinion as well that are saying, well, I mean, much ado about nothing. Oh no, much ado about a really serious and concerning set of issues.
Very well said, Alejandro. And also there's a lot of literature coming up now, which sort of with sometimes even, contradictory sort of evidence in terms of the impact of some of these platforms. So before I move on to the next question, this was like excellent, I think. I just want to sort of maybe highlight that something that came that was sort of in many of your comments was sort of the business models of these platforms on one side with maximizing engagement type objectives, and that sort of is, I think, maybe at root of a lot of the issues that one can think about, but also something that Daron mentioned, and I also keep thinking about this issue, like even if we forget about those aspects, just the sheer connectivity that these platforms and technologies enable. And Daron mentioned that sort of completely sidelining our physical communication patterns or social networks. So would we run into issues even because of that, or how big a role does the sort of the business models play a role here? Marta.
Well, we can draw a comparison between the digital communications on the one hand and traditional broadcast cable communications on the other, or print for that matter. And depending on the age cohort to this day, there are many for whom their primary sources of news or information are those more legacy media sources. And I can say that even without getting to AI or tech, there has been, at least in the United States, now well documented, a real difference between the media ecosystem that leans to the right and the media ecosystem that leans to the left, in that the one that leans to the right is pretty much cut off from other sources, and there's mutual reinforcement. Now that's exacerbated when it's digital, but it's true even when we talk about television and radio. Whereas with the left-leaning media in the United States, there were just as many crazy conspiracy theories that were promoted in 2016 and 2020, but they got kind of dampened in just the way Daron described. People were part of other networks that said, oh, that doesn't make any sense. So the problem is, in part, whether it's fomented by technology or otherwise, when sub-communities get cut off from broader communities, it gets much, much more dangerous and difficult to weed out misinformation, rumor, polarization, fear, and so forth.
Very good. Daron.
Yeah, I just actually, again, I want to amplify what Martha said, because, there is one very important study by several economists, or very, very good economists or experts in this area. And the one challenging finding they emphasize is that, if you look at by cohort, age cohort, the groups that seem to believe a lot of misinformation are the older groups that are not using Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, etc. And they use this fact to question whether really it is online media and AI algorithms. But actually, exactly like Martha said, when you look at the details, that is cable news, right-wing cable news, such as Fox News would be the leading example. And it is replicating the business model of social media. It's 24 hours, keeping people glued with attention grabbing, engagement grabbing, and replacing individuals' real social networks from which they were getting social, democratic, political information and feedback. And that is the business model that Facebook, other social media companies, and to some degree Google, have replicated in a much more powerful form. So in some sense, I would turn that finding on its head and say, this is actually providing a broader perspective on what's going on due to the business model and the regulatory environment that has allowed this type of business model to flourish.
Thank you, Daron. So it's the perfect storm of bringing this connectivity, cutting off from other, sources, as well as the business models that we see in a number of cases across the history. Alejandro, I don't know if you want to add, or we can move to the next question.
I think we can move on to the next question.
Okay, so I started very negatively. I'm an optimist actually, so I don't want to only talk about negative issues. Are there any positives, like many more major positive effects of social media that we must preserve while we're trying to regulate and improve the current environment?
If I may, I could.
Please, Alejandro, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think there are several very valuable ones. One of the key characteristics of social media is that the barriers to entry for new discussions, informations, communities to participate in public discourse are really very low. And that's extremely valuable, in particular when we think about, I mean, starting from protest movements and opposition movements in semi-authoritarian, the vast majority of countries are semi-authoritarian countries. And I think those are very important issues. But it's not just in a political term, let's call them non-mainstream communities. Sexual diversity, social movements of all sorts, feminist movements. They provide sources of communication, of mutual learning, of community creation, and all of those are really, really very valuable. And it is also the case that there are some segments or there are some examples of social media engagement in which you can actually face some degree of discourse, interaction, and political moderation, to the extent that, I mean, you typically don't speak about politics in every single one of your groups, but you can actually get in some of your, I don't know, WhatsApp groups or other groups in Facebook or others, some other of these platforms, what we think of as weak links, people that are not necessarily as close to you, that provide an alternative viewpoint in certain areas, and that actually has shown to be able to moderate political opinion or increase your level of knowledge about certain issues. So we need to, I think that the key issue when we start thinking about how we regulate these things is to think very clearly about what are the things that we actually want to preserve and what are the things that we actually need to cut back or to regulate or to rethink, as Daron said, the business model, so that we're better able to address them without losing some of these very, very valuable issues. And just to put one example there, when we think about transgender communities, there's so little information out there from formal sources about even how to identify themselves, how to connect, all sorts of access to all sorts of support groups and the like. If it were in the absence of social media, conditions would be even worse for them in a number of societies that are way behind in terms of what we should be providing to individuals of this or many other groups worldwide.
Good. Thank you. That's excellent. Daron, do you want to jump?
Yeah, I absolutely also, there are many socially valuable things that online communication and social media can be used for, and some of them are actually being realized. You emphasized connectivity. I think what type of connectivity it is matters. Social media enables people to be more connected to their existing social network, their childhood friends, perhaps, that they would have liked to keep in touch, and now they can do that at a lower cost. Groups that share their hobbies. One important political theory, not everybody agrees with it, but I think probably has some validity, is the sort of social capital that comes from overlapping club membership that, for example, people like Robert Putnam emphasizes. So in principle, social media could enable more cross-cutting communities being formed, so actually broaden and complement individuals' real social network rather than replacing and decimating them. And second, as Alejandro mentioned, it creates lower entry barriers. And that's true in many domains, and it could be used, and it is sometimes used, for positive social value. There's a very interesting paper by some of my students showing the rollout of different languages of Facebook across the world, enabled small businesses to enter and advertise and increase their sales and also exports. So it sort of acted as a democratizing force when it came to business entry in a very effective way. And another sort of political science idea that I think people were hopeful about at the early stages of social media, sort of going back to Jürgen Habermas's public sphere, we can form better communities for better information sharing using the tools that are made available by online communication technologies. That, I think, has been completely unrealized. There are some proto examples of that sort of thing, but I think on the whole, nothing comparable to the early expectations. But I don't think that's because early expectations were completely wrong. It's just that's not the direction in which we have provided incentives to platforms to develop the technology. And it also partly because, and this I'm mentioning this because I think it will intersect with our later policy discussion. I think the overall social media technology was shaped by a mistaken libertarian ideology that, you can provide the benefits of communication, community building, or whatever it is without regulation. And I think that was a non-starter. So if you're going to build like Habermas-like communities in which you will encourage people to be more democratically communicating and sharing ideas, you really need the regulation from the platforms themselves, as well as perhaps public institutions, that will make sure that conversations are not hijacked and bots don't take over, extremist ideologies don't use this as a platform for propagating hate speech. So it's just like, let the technology be there and it will develop. I think that's a wrong model. And perhaps we are now in a better position to understand that than we were in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But I think I wanted to sort of put that on the table as well, because I think it will relate to other things we'll talk about.
Very good, very good. Martha.
Well, picking up on where Daron just finished, the ideology of unregulated speech is also a misnomer. We think about, take academic settings where we have free-flowing conversation. It's not unregulated. Professors regulate very much. There are rules about who participates, when, where, how. Even here, we're raising our hands. So it's really a basic point that's about economic freedom as well as speech freedom, which is you need some rules so that you can actually coordinate activity. But on the issue of the positive, let me just identify, it's related to what Alejandro and Daron have said, but slightly different, is it's not like that legacy media was so great. It was very limited in whose perspectives were amplified, what stories could be told. So the democratization that's enabled by the digital tools allows citizen journalism, allows communities that never had access to media to tell their stories, to be heard, to contribute. Also interesting, like the recent research done by LinkedIn shows that weak social networks actually are more productive in terms of finding jobs than strong social networks. And that is something where the digital is very helpful. And one more, which is, it turns out, this has been true in the gaming industry and others, that the digital revolution has demonstrated how much people want to be makers. People want to not just be passive recipients. But just to not maybe tip it back to the negative, let's at least acknowledge the mixed consequences of that. When we have democratized tools for creating deep fakes, so that we have a video that looks like it's a political figure who's saying things that that person never said, and now it's in the hands of anybody, there can be some real dangers and real harms that are unleashed. And I also think that the same may be true when it comes to social mobilization. So while Arab Spring seemed very promising about the ways in which digital media could help people produce a positive social change, we've seen it used, obviously, for January 6th. And also, we've seen governments backlash and use surveillance techniques that never before existed to squelch dissent and protest.
Terrific, terrific. This is actually a great, I think, lead into my next question. I think we're now building onto what can we do about all this if we want to preserve the good that you all beautifully highlighted and discouraged the bad. What are the main tools at our disposal? So, I just like to maybe highlight a few, which is should we be thinking about more platform accountability and editorial responsibility? And, I mean, I guess the natural question then is, can this be done despite Section 230, which really shields platforms from, this liability against content created by their users? And this is the question that I think we sort of think about quite a bit, is how should we balance such a reform of 230 with First Amendment protections? I'd like to especially ask this question to Marta. I know she's thinking about this quite a bit in her book, as well as other writings. Then also, some of the other tools that Alejandro mentioned, should we be thinking about better algorithms, technologies, maybe making sure we know the origins, provenance information for these sources, or maybe should we really think about direct regulation, other policies such as taxation, antitrust, and what's the role of public pressure on all this? So maybe we'll start with Marta, because I'm really very curious about her take on all this.
Well, you laid the ground very well. There's no silver bullet. There's no single tool that's going to help us here. We're going to need pieces of direct regulation, indirect regulation, self-regulation, variety of tools, technologies. I absolutely agree on that. I think that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, whatever its intention, it has been interpreted by the U.S. courts to really strike down all kinds of liabilities, way beyond anything that's in the words of the statute itself, for platform companies. And I think it should be modified. I think it should be modified if the immunity is of such great value to the platform companies. They should get something, they should have to give something in exchange. So you get the immunity if. Now we can argue about if what, but I think minimally, engagement in some self-regulatory behaviors, including takedown upon demonstration of a problem with any kind of a message, participation in self-regulatory organizations that have standards. Again, we've seen this in other industries. We saw it in the early days of television and cable. The role of self-regulation in the financial industry. The last panel touched on this, the role of self-regulatory entities that have procedural as well as substantive standards. And especially as we get closer and closer to speech and political speech, I like having a cushion of distance away from direct government regulation. So that's of a particular appeal to me. But so conditions on immunity for Section 230 would be one way to propel that. But frankly, there's nothing stopping the platform companies now from creating such self-certification organizations where they can actually set some standards and have a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. I also think that there are very important tools, for example, taxation. We could tax targeted ads and actually make it not at the core of the business model of the large platforms. Antitrust, I'm a skeptic about that, even if successful, which would require some dramatic and heroic changes in existing antitrust law in the US and even in Europe. The remedy breakup, you break up Meta, into 3 companies, there's still some of the biggest companies in the world. I don't see that as a great solution unless it's a tool to try to produce self-regulation or some kind of consent decrees. But I think that the technological solutions are also very interesting. You know, when it was an undergraduate group at the University of Chicago that as a project came up with an algorithm to actually identify using plain language searching opinion pieces that took the opposite of what a particular reader had been focused on. You know, undergraduates produced that algorithm in a semester. I think that the great engineers at the great platform companies could come up with something even better.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Daron.
Yeah, there's much I agree with in Martha's perspective, but I must say I have a somewhat different take. First of all, I don't think self-regulation would work. I don't think technological solutions would work. I think they would just take the focus from the real problem. I agree with Martha, antitrust would certainly not work. It's exactly the wrong solution to the problems. But I think the bigger issue is that any solution we try to bring while maintaining two layers of the current business model wouldn't work. So the way that I would like to think about the problem is, what are the levers we can most effectively use in order to change the business model? And the two layers of that business model, in my opinion, are one, at the social media level, what we have already talked about, digital ad, targeted digital ad funded model, which then makes these companies go after engagement, attention seeking, emotional outrage, other types of reactions that would keep them more receptive to ads. But that itself is undergirded by another business model ecosystem, which is data collection. So, sometimes we tend to separate this into a Facebook, Twitter problem, but no, I don't think it's a Facebook, Twitter problem. It's a broader problem, which includes Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and digital companies more generally, which is that they are in a binge for uncontrolled data collection, which then empowers them relative to users, consumers, workers, and their competitors. And of course, generates its own way of monetizing this data. Digital ads is one aspect of it, but there are others that I think some of them have also socially pernicious effects. And I think what we really need to think about are regulation, taxation, and other policies that can start making a dent into these business models. Ideally, we would want these business models to significantly change, and also the data collection to be much better regulated and much more limited, and also what these data can be used to be much more limited. I don't think it is a surprise that Wikipedia does not have misinformation. I don't think it's a surprise that Netflix, which collects information and makes a lot of recommendations, but doesn't have misinformation. We can worry about the information that Netflix collects as well, but because their business model is not funded by digital ads that they send, they have a much better system of regulating what they do with that information, and regulating who can have access to that information or build on it. And so that already says, we're going to have to really grapple with these much bigger issue of how can we steer these companies, and many new ones that will enter, away from trying to just monetize this data collection. But data collection itself is a problem. So I gave the example of Netflix. I don't think it's a problem that Netflix will propagate misinformation. I don't think that will ever be a major issue. But Netflix also sits on top of an enormous amount of data, and that's going to create a lot more other problems down the line against its competitors, against what Netflix knows about the consumers, about what Netflix can do towards its own employees. So I think it's part of this ecosystem, and that's where AI really comes in, because data collection is really not possible without AI. Data processing is not possible without AI, and AI is not possible without data. So that AI is part of this data, this bigger ecosystem. So I think that's where we really need to bring the technologies and the regulation of these technologies into the conversation. But I've gone on already for too long. I'll pass it on to others.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if Alejandro, I'm curious your perspective, because it's sort of coming from maybe a little international Latin American perspective. How do you think about sort of what tools would be most effective?
I think that the key tool is to keep in mind that we must have basic agreement on what it is that we want. And this is something that Eric Schmidt started this conversation a few hours ago with. And I think it's especially important when we talk about social media and the regulation of information and speech and organization and social movements through that. I very much agree with what Daron has said about these two sort of pillars of how the business model of social media operate. I think it is quite possibly much more likely that reform attempts will be sector specific. I think that's what, and I probably agree with what Daron has said, which is that it's actually going to lose focus on the actual problems that we are facing. But when we think about these reforms, I think we need to be in agreement of what it is that we want. But I think it's also important, even if we have a broader agreement on what it is that we want to do with social media generally and the business model itself, that we stay aware of other players that are actually engaging in this ecosystem, economic or in this market in particular. And let me bring an example from the realm of electoral politics and emerging economies, and even in the United States. Even if candidates were wholeheartedly committing to, the most decent use of social media and to not engage in polarization efforts and not to buy platforms that are doing bots that are probably being bought some other place the world over to do negative campaigning and all of these misinformation strategies. There will be electoral entrepreneurs and consultants and market strategists that are going to try to convince them that if they don't do that, then they're going to be wiped off of the electoral opportunity or the election itself. And that is happening in every single election in every single country of the world. These entrepreneurs, some of them are acting within the realm of the law. I mean, they're perfectly lawful. Some are not. Some are domestic. And many of them are international. Some are related to political movements. Some of them are being created and hired by contractors that are want to curry favor with elected officials in order to get the next big public works project. And I think when we think about regulation, we need to be aware that precisely the business model of these platforms is not just relevant to these platforms themselves, but to entrepreneurs that are entering this market and that are actually creating many of the most pernicious effects that social media allow for their existence. They're actually being generated by others that take advantage of this business model and the way in which we have, in a sense, I agree with Martha and Daron, failed to regulate.
If I could just say that I agree with all of these very good points. I just think we have to be aware that the government's not very good at doing a lot of things. And the idea that we're all going to agree about how to regulate in this area when we can't agree about much of anything, and we can't even agree on who the we is, really tough, which is one of the reasons maybe I spoke too quickly that I talked about self-regulation. Obviously, leaving these issues to the private companies has not worked. We need regulation. The question is through what mechanisms? And the mechanisms, there's not going to be a silver bullet, as I said. I do believe that the platforms should be primary actors, the same way that we have gatekeepers in other industries. We are about to have a potential disaster in the United States Supreme Court on this very question, because we have one federal court has ruled that efforts to forbid moderation by platform companies violates the First Amendment. The other another court has allowed such regulation. And let's just start with basic facts. Twitter removes each day 1 million fake accounts. They are moderating more than we can even imagine all the time. In the algorithms, they're moderating. With human beings, they're moderating. We have now governments, US and around the world, saying that they should not. I think this is a big mistake. They're in the best position to do a lot of the moderating.
Mhm.
They actually are running the technologies and they have the expertise. The problem is they don't have the right incentives. We have to create incentives so that they moderate with enough room for freedom and diversity and pluralism and so forth.
Okay, Daron wants to jump very.
Yes, yeah, I just want to amplify that point. I think there is, it's exactly what like Marta said. I think government regulation of what's on these platforms is not feasible, nor is it desirable, because it would be a very clear slippery slope to sort of government's monitoring, surveillance, and other sort of tools that are very readily available with this abundant data environment. So I think the type of regulation that I find much more promising and can be much cruder, doesn't need to be so well calibrated, is exactly the one that changes the business model.
Yeah.
So a digital ad tax, that does not require, it does, of course, you need to agree on it, but it does not require anything major in terms of the government sort of understanding what is fake speech and what is not. All we need to do is agree that we need a digital ad tax and how large it should be. Or the government sort of removing some of the protections that are within the context of Section 230. Although again, I think removing Section 230 is not that easy unless the government can be relied on through its courts or through its other branches to decide what is and what is not to be protected. And that's another slippery slope. So that's why trying to change the business model, I think, is both most effective and most feasible.
Excellent. I think I have many more questions on this topic, but I'm also worried we're running out of time. I would like to basically go to one more question, which is, I think, on everybody's mind. We've talked about a lot of issues, technical, social, but there's also the worry that it might not be possible to enact any kind of legislation, given how polarized our political landscape is, at least in the US. And there are varied opinions clearly on what the real problem is that we're trying to fix, going back to Alejandro's point and Eric's, I guess, earlier. So I just want to maybe ask you, are we really in a bind here, or is there a way, is there a path forward? Could we somehow, make progress on these topics somehow?
Well, one of the fascinating features of this moment is that there is almost universal acknowledgement that there's a problem. There's just disagreements about the solution. And so in part, unfortunately, we then run into the problems of our political structures in many countries that make it hard to actually come up with productive solutions. And that creates a huge problem, but also an opportunity for civil society, for universities, think tanks, and others to try to propose alternatives. I don't think I see that there's some audience questions coming in that are very related. I don't think that the government should replace the entities. I don't think that's a good idea. That is a recipe for all kinds of suppression of speech. But at the same time, and I'll just say this one more thing, I think it's a great thing that the problem we're talking about is global. And because it means that we have competition about regulation. The European Union is pursuing regulations that the US will never pursue. Mm-hmm. But guess what? US-based companies have to comply. And we have then some competition with regulations coming from Australia, coming from England, coming from other countries, Mexico included. And I think that that's a good thing, because regulatory competition may produce better results.
Good, very good.
Yeah, if I may add to this.
Please.
I mean, the issue of regulation is this is a multiple equilibrium that we are actually, there are some countries that are going to do some stuff. There are some others that are going to do some other stuff. Of course, ideally, we would have both the European Union and the United States sort of regulating in the same way, because in the way in which we think about, the progress of democracies, that would actually be the best possible. That's just not going to happen, just like Martha said. but I think to the extent that communities like the one that we have here in the MIT AI Policy Forum are able to at least trace the contours of what these equilibria look like and what these types of regulations can actually achieve, we will be able to influence policymakers to say, at least we have a sense of what is it that we are more likely or less likely to achieve given different sets of strategies. That, just like Martha said, it's not just one silver bullet, it's a number of issues. And it's also going to be sector specific in each country. I mean, some things are going to be relative to the media. Some are going to be specific about political communication. Some are going to be specific about, I don't know, different types of consumption, for example, of consumer goods and issues related to medicine and health. But I think to the extent that we are able to even if very generally, express as clearly as possible what are the types of issues that we really want to emphasize and what are going to be the trade-offs. I think even for political environments as polarized as the United States or others, there will be some room for innovation. I actually think that it's a great I mean, there's a great opportunity, just like Martha said, for some competitive regulatory strategies. And I can tell you, in Latin America, it is certainly a huge area of concern, in particular with regards to electoral issues. And we actually happen to have somewhat strong regulatory environments in Latin America. The Mexican case is a good one. The Brazilian case is another one. And of course, they're always very contested, and there's always polarization, and they're never, quote unquote, rock solid. But there are some approaches that I think we will see. And it's probably better if we actually inform them with the best data available, with the best science available, and also to bring them back to international discussions about what can be done. Because I'm sure some authorities are actually going to make progress. Some actually are going to make mistakes, just like the one that Martha was warning us against.
Very good. Daron, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we are in a bind, meaning that the current environment created partly by the online communication environment is making a solution much harder, but being in a bind doesn't mean we are hopeless. I think meaningful regulation that changes the business model can have transformative effects. Unfortunately, you know, I agree with Martha that there is bipartisan agreement that something needs to be done, but I don't think there is bipartisan agreement on what needs to be done, or that solutions that, at least as I see them, would right now get support either from Republicans or even from the wing of the Democrats that are so closely allied with the tech world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So this is great. I'd like to bring also our audience into the conversation, because I'm seeing several questions here, and I will try actually maybe to combine some of them, because they're really going into sort of certain key questions. So the most popular, most voted audience question is, given that for-profit is the singular focus of social media companies, should we, as a society, simply eliminate them and make them government entities? And I think this also relates to some other question here, which is basically, what would a good or ideal social media platform look like if you waved a magic wand and created social media platforms from scratch today? What features would it have, and how can we make a good social media platform under existing regulations? Well, that's a very good thought exercise, I think, for us after all the conversation. Daron, go for it.
Yeah, I think the reality is, of course, complex, but a good way of summarizing decades of work looking at hundreds of years of history is that governments are typically not very good at managing frontier technologies, let alone even mature technology innovations. So governments play a much better role in setting big agendas. You know, they can set agendas for Manhattan Project or fighting climate change. or fighting COVID. They can be very useful in regulating things, but not actually running these technologies. And I think right now, especially the human capital in US government public service is completely lacking to rival anything that the tech world can do in terms of innovation or even, operation of these technologies. And I think, again, let me give you Wikipedia example. I cannot imagine Wikipedia being a government entity and achieving what it has. But Wikipedia has become one of the most valuable resources online, precisely because I think it has a business model that does not rely on exploiting data. So this is something governments can easily achieve, political will and political polarization issues notwithstanding. So I think that's what we should focus on. The governments should be pushed, and this is where public pressure comes in. Governments, political parties should be pushed in taking meaningful action to change the business model, not try to run or not try to get engaged in the minutia of what information should be regulated and how AI algorithms should be designed.
Martha.
Oh, I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I would add that there's not going to be one social media platform that will work for everyone, and nor would it be good to have only one. Even if there were one per country, that's not a good idea. Competition produces better results. But I would add to it, think about the metaphor of city planning, zoning, regulations that actually call for the construction of media platforms where people can create different rooms, if you will, different settings for different kinds of standards. Maybe for children, maybe educational, maybe this will be a place that there is no politics-free zone. One reason Wikipedia works is that there's the creation of a culture and a culture of agreement. Cultures are very hard to create and sustain in large settings, and so we need smaller settings. We need to create the settings where there can be cultures that are renewable and can grow. I think I've been lucky enough to be part of many online communities that are better than some of the horrible ones, but they involve moderation and a set of commitments to create such a culture. I do think that the next thing is going to be here before we figure out how to regulate the last thing. And so in part, I think that governments now need to be thinking ahead about how to build the capacities in civil society, in education, in other sectors, to be ready for whatever the metaverse is going to bring to us, whatever the deep fakes are going to bring to us. And I also think that there's a role for governments to support the nonprofit alternatives, the civil society, in the same way that public media has been an important contributor, really raising the standards of media on television and radio. And we've never had a public internet. Maybe there could be a competitor, not to replace, but a competitor.
Terrific.
I was actually going to chime in very much the same direction. And I think what governments really need to do is to invest and to generate the resources on a number of areas. Martha gave a couple of examples, but what about data generation of funds for additional research, so that we not just understand better the way in which these algorithms are working, but also how to develop new algorithms or platforms that prevent misinformation, that prevent polarization. Let's call them platforms that are democratically sustainable, much as we have invested in energy transition, so that we have a number of technologies that are actually going to stop global warming. Exactly the same way. If we can think of some of these concerns, we have labeled them out. We have, and there is strong consensus that these are some of the issues that we are worried about. We have much research to do, but we could also develop and generate the kind of support financially and alongside academic institutions, just like you said, Martha, civil society organizations, multilateral organizations. We had the OECD alongside with us today as well, to generate the research that can actually create these capacities and generate the human capital that is needed in all areas and all segments of society to deal with this, but also to generate the kind of platforms themselves and the business models themselves that can actually be democratically sustainable, let's call them that way, or whatever other way you want to call them, that would emphasize an alternative way of communicating, and also taking advantage of all of the things that we have already mentioned that are also very, very valuable. That's a kind of public good that is not going to be generated unless governments actually create them. And I think we need to be very, very aware of that. And an additional point on what governments should be doing is all of this data collection that has already been going on, we need to make sure that we have ways of using it effectively and I mean, carefully, of course, but to make sure that we actually have some sense of what are the effects of what the social media platforms are doing and the new ones are going to be doing. So I think that there are two very obvious ones.
Good, terrific. Daron?
Yeah, just 30-second addition on one thing that Martha already mentioned. We are correctly worried about AI, social media, but the current ecosystem means that new technologies are making the same mistakes, but now on steroids. There is an incredible amount of misplaced enthusiasm about Web 3.0, and it is probably going to go in exactly the same direction as social media in sort of amplifying exactly the same business models and the same mistakes and the same divisive implications at a broader scale. So before we can actually deal with this problem, probably we're going to be confronted with new ones.
Thank you. This is fantastic. I see Alexander showing up. So we're probably coming to the end of our allocated time. This has been a fantastic discussion. So Martha, Daron, and Alejandro, thank you so very much for this fascinating and insightful conversation. I very much would like to thank everyone also in our audience for their participation. I think what this discussion has shown is there's a lot of facets to this challenging problem. I feel like, we're making progress in trying to understand what are the key issues, what are some of the tools at hand, and sort of, I feel what is needed moving forward is really bring together this diverse set of perspectives, opinions, to be able to sort of, I think having these discussions and conversations to be able to make progress in a societally more beneficial way and hopefully address these questions before the next new wave of technologies hit us. And I feel AIPF is really a great forum for being able to achieve this. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you on this interesting topic. And definitely pulling in Alexander, because I know this is a topic very dear to his heart as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and to you, Alexander.
Thank you so much. So first of all, now I become this bearer of the bad news. Whenever I show up, the interesting conversations die out. So that's good to know, Asu, thank you. But yeah, really, thank you for this panel. This was like a very fitting capstone for the whole summit. It actually very characteristically, it went much deeper into this topic than what, again, one typically sees in this space. I want to highlight here some of the themes here, in particular, the systemic nature of the problem we are facing, and that actually, in some sense, is much more pervasive than people might think at first. It's not just about, Facebook and Twitter. There is something much broader going on here. And also that, we really need to have this kind of broader lens on what is kind of uniquely new about social media, but also what is not necessarily new, what we have seen in the past, just now replayed in a bit different configuration. And also, I like the part about, just thinking about, with all the bad press that social media have, what is good there? What actually might be there to save? Because there are things, as you said, there are things worth saving. And finally, most importantly, how can we finally go forward here? And I also appreciate the remark here. So thank you so much, Alejandro, Daron, Marta, and thank you so much, Asu, for your excellent moderation. Now, this was the last element of our AIPF summit. I hope you enjoyed what we put together. I definitely did. I might be biased, but I definitely did, and I definitely did enjoy it more than I expected to. we covered quite a lot of space today. So we talk about global landscape of AI policy, of how diverse and difficult to reconcile this space is, because you have all these different countries with different cultures, political cultures, economic cultures, different objectives, and all of them kind of think about similar topics, but again, try to approach it from a very different perspective. Some of the countries that should be thinking about this are not thinking about this, which is yet another problem. Then there are questions about trustfulness of AI and kind of what challenges lie ahead to get there. And then we did this kind of deep dive into AI and finance. We talk about consumer finance, then we talk about the questions of AI in investment, and in general, like how, what impact AI has on the markets and how they operate. And finally, in this panel that we just had, we had this, Pandora box, opened up this Pandora box of social media, like kind of all the problems and difficulties and all these new connections and challenges and opportunities as well that it provides. So, hopefully this gave you a glimpse of what AI Policy Forum wants to accomplish. Okay, so there is this intellectual space, but there is also there is some purpose behind all of that. So what we are trying to do here is we try to create a forum where kind of the needed multidisciplinary perspectives from different parts of academia, industry, regulators, policymakers, other societal organizations can really engage in a deep and meaningful way. Again, that's something that was very important to us, to go deeper than what you usually can get in a news flash or in a quick interview. I think we accomplished that. We also wanted to articulate some of the key problems that the scientists, industry, and policymakers should focus on in their engagement. So kind of trying to make sure like it's, even social media is, as you just have discussed, is such a broad topic, where do we start? What kind of problems or kind of how can we get any headway on solving these problems? And also, finally, we hope that this event is kind of provides a call to action for students, researchers, again, policymakers, people in industry to really engage in policymaking space and vice versa. Like, I think this is really important. And actually, you could hear it in particular in panel 2, that this is what's needed. It's just like, but also Daron mentioned it in this panel. So we really need to kind of all hands aboard to really engage with these questions. So this is the mission we are on as AIPF. And today is not the end, it's just the beginning. So I look forward to telling you more of what we will be hopefully accomplishing in the near future. And hopefully we hope to engage with some of you around these topics. So thank you and goodbye.